Look at the nearest piece of paper around you. A receipt, a notebook, a cardboard box. You have probably touched paper a dozen times today without noticing it once. But for most of human history, this thing did not exist, and its absence shaped absolutely everything. Long before paper, memory lived on stone. Deep inside caves, our ancestors pressed pigment-stained hands against rock walls, leaving the first deliberate records humanity ever made. A handprint that said, simply, I was here. It worked. Some of those marks have survived 40,000 years, but you cannot fold a cave wall into your pocket, and you cannot carry it to the next valley. So when the first cities rose in Mesopotamia, people reached for the material under their feet, mud. Scribes pressed red styluses into damp clay tablets, recording grain shipments, debts, marriages, and laws. Roll a carved cylinder seal across the wet surface, and you had a signature. Fire the tablet in a kiln, and the record became nearly indestructible. The world's first bureaucracy was born, written entirely in mud. But clay had a problem, and the problem was weight. A single letter could weigh as much as a brick. A merchant's archive filled entire rooms. Moving important records meant strapping wooden crates onto donkeys and hoping the animals survived the crossing, and if a tablet slipped from your hands, years of records shattered on the floor in a single heartbeat. One earthquake, one collapsed storehouse, and entire city's memory could vanish in an afternoon. There was another cost, too. Because writing was slow and materials were cumbersome, literacy stayed locked inside a tiny professional class. Scribes trained for years, apprenticed as children, their cramped hands earning them status most people would never touch. Everyone else carried knowledge the old way in their heads, passed voice to voice around the fire, one generation reciting to the next, and praying nothing was lost in the telling. Civilizations grew anyway. Archives swelled. Temple storerooms groaned under tens of thousands of fired tablets, catalogued and shelved by lamplight, consulted by officials who walked the aisles like men walking through a frozen library of stone. Humanity had solved the problem of remembering. What it had not solved was the problem of carrying memory anywhere. Some scribes experimented. They tried inking marks onto smooth wooden boards and watched the grain swallow their strokes. They tied knots into cords and cut notches into tally sticks. Clever tricks that could count sheep but could never hold a poem. The search for a better surface was already centuries old, and still unanswered. And then, along a green river to the west, someone picked up a marsh reed, hollow, light, and endlessly abundant, and had an idea that would make memory almost weightless. Every spring, along the banks of the Nile, a strange triangular reed grew taller than a man. The Egyptians called it the plat of the river. We call it papyrus, and it is the reason the word paper exists at all. Around 5,000 years ago, Egyptian craftsmen discovered something remarkable hiding inside that reed. Sliced the stem into thin, pale strips, lay one layer vertically, another horizontally across it, like a woven mat. Press the layers under heavy stones, and the plant's own sap glues them into a single smooth sheet. No chemicals, no adhesives, just pressure, sunlight, and the quiet chemistry of a marsh plant. The result changed everything. A papyrus sheet weighed almost nothing. A scribe could roll 20 sheets into a scroll and tuck a year of records under one arm, the same records that would have needed a donkey cart in Mesopotamia. Ink flowed across the burnished surface in fast, fluid strokes. For the first time in history, writing could move at the speed of thought. Egypt understood exactly what it had. Papyrus became a state industry and one of the kingdom's most valuable exports. Workshops lined the delta. Drying yards glowed white under the desert sun. Scrabble schools trained armies of boys to feed the pharaoh's paperwork, because an empire that could write things down could tax, organize, and remember on a scale no rival could match. Tax registers, medical treatises, love poems, and funeral texts meant to guide souls through eternity. All of it flowed onto the river plant, and then papyrus went international. Rolled bundles sailed out of Nile harbors to every corner of the Mediterranean. Greek philosophers wrote on Egyptian sheets. The great library of Alexandria stacked hundreds of thousands of scrolls toward its ceilings. Accumulated knowledge of the ancient world, resting entirely on pressed marsh reeds. But papyrus carried two hidden weaknesses. The first was time. In dry Egyptian air, a scroll could last centuries. Anywhere humid, it cracked, flaked, and crumbled. Librarians fought a permanent war against decay, copying dying scrolls onto fresh ones before the words vanished forever. Every book that survived antiquity survived because someone, somewhere, kept recopying it by hand. The second weakness was geography. Papyrus grew in one place on earth, the Nile. Every empire that wanted to write depended on Egyptian marshes and Egyptian trade routes. When supplies tightened and prices climbed, rivals turned to a costly alternative, parchment made from stretched animal skin, durable, beautiful, and so expensive that a single large book could consume an entire herd. The ancient world had two writing surfaces, one fragile, one unaffordable. Neither could serve everyone. The real answer was taking shape at the far end of the earth, in the Chinese courtyard, in a pile of rags and old fishing nets that everyone else had thrown away. In the year 105, an official of the Chinese Han court named Cai Lun presented the emperor with something that looked almost worthless, a thin, pale, flexible sheet. No gold, no jade, just a sheet. And yet, historians rank that moment among the most important in human history, because Cai Lun had just presented the world's first true paper. China had been wrestling with the same problem as everyone else. Official records were written on bamboo slips, bound together with cord, so heavy that a single book could require a cart. The elegant alternative was silk, smooth and beautiful, and so expensive that writing on it was almost an act of wealth. The empire needed something light like silk and cheap like mud. Nothing like it existed. Cai Lun's genius was to look in the garbage. Old fishing nets, worn-out hemp rags, tree bark, the fibrous waste no one wanted. His workshop soaked the scraps until they softened, then pounded them into a wet pulp, millions of individual plant fibers floating free in water. Then came the move that defines paper making to this day. Dip a fine bamboo screen into the vat, lift it slowly and perfectly level, and let the water drain away. What remains? On the mesh is a thin, even mat of interlocked fibers. Press it, dry it against a sun-warmed wall, peel it off. That sheet is paper. Every page you have ever touched descends from that exact gesture. And here is the beautiful part: needed no rare plant, no sacrificed herd, no single river valley. Paper could be made from almost any fiber, almost anywhere, by anyone who knew the technique. It was strong, light, foldable, and absorbed ink like it was born for the brush. The emperor understood immediately. Cai Lun was honored. The method spread through imperial workshops, and production scaled, from an experiment into an industry, within a generation. The effects rippled outward fast. Couriers galloped across the empire, carrying dispatches that weighed grams instead of kilograms. Government offices reorganized around documents that could be folded, filed, and carried in a sleeve. Students, who could never afford silk, copied the classics onto cheap sheets, and knowledge began sliding down the social ladder for the first time. Artisans stamped ink wood blocks onto paper, quietly rehearsing the idea of printing centuries before Europe imagined it. China knew it was holding a treasure, and it behaved like it. Paper-making became a guarded craft, its recipes passed master to apprentice under oaths of secrecy. For roughly 600 years, the secret stayed home. Paper flowed westward along the Silk Road as a product, but the knowledge of how to make it did not. It would take a war, a lost battle, and a handful of captured craftsmen finally set the secret free. Because a secret this useful never stays secret forever. It only waits for history to pry it loose. Before paper traveled west, it conquered the east, and something unexpected happened along the way. Every culture that received it made it better. Buddhist monks were paper's first great couriers. Carrying sutras through mountain passes and across straits, they brought the craft to Korea, where paper makers refined it with long mulberry fibers rinsed in cold, clear water. The result, hanji, was so tough it could be twisted into cord, armor lining, even furniture. Korean archives written on it have survived 1,000 years. From Korea, the technique crossed the sea to Japan, and there, paper making became something close to meditation. In snow country workshops, artisans rocked their screens in slow rhythmic waves, layering fibers crosswise into washi. Sheets so thin light glowed through them, yet strong enough to last centuries. Japanese paper makers treated winter itself as an ingredient, using icy mountain water to keep fibers crisp and pure. And then Japan did something remarkable. It let paper escape the page entirely. Paper became architecture, shoji screens that turned harsh sunlight into a soft glow filling entire rooms. Paper became light itself, lanterns swaying. Over festival streets, hundreds of warm floating flames wrapped in translucent sheets. Paper became umbrellas coated in oil to shrug off the rain that once destroyed it. It became fans, kites, folded cranes passed between a mother's hands and a child's. In East Asia, paper was not just a way to record life. It became part of the texture of living. Meanwhile, the craft kept moving. Through Vietnam and across Southeast Asia, local workshops folded their own identities into the sheets, some pressing real flower petals into ceremonial paper, so the page itself carried a garden. Monasteries built rotating libraries, great lacquered wheels, holding thousands of scrolls, turned by pilgrims as an act of devotion. Schools multiplied wherever paper grew cheap, because cheap paper has always meant one thing: more people learning to read. But the most consequential road ran west, camel. Caravans carried paper bundles out through China's frontier gates and along the Silk Road, across deserts, through dust storms, past caravanserais where traders from a dozen lands shared fires and rumors. For centuries, paper traveled this road strictly as merchandise. Buyers in Samarkand and beyond could purchase the sheets, admire them, write on them, but not make them. The recipe remained China's alone. Then, in the year 751, two empires collided at a river called Talis, in the heart of Central Asia. The Abbasid Caliphate and Tang China met in battle, and when the fighting ended, among the prisoners marched west were men whose hands held a secret worth more than any spoils of war. They were paper makers, and the world was about to change owners of its most important technology. According to tradition, the captured Chinese paper makers were brought to Samarkand, and within a generation, that city's paper was famous across the Islamic world. Water wheels turned along its irrigation channels. Drying yards spread under the Central Asian sun. The craft adapted instantly to local materials, flax and hemp replacing mulberry, and the sheets came out strong, smooth, and abundant. Then Baghdad got involved, and everything accelerated. The Abbasid Caliphate was building the most intellectually ambitious city on earth, and paper arrived at exactly the right moment. Mills rose along the Tigris, and in the House of Wisdom, scholars launched one of history's greatest projects, translating the knowledge of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians onto fresh paper pages. Euclid, Aristotle, Galen, works that might have crumbled away on dying papyrus were copied, studied, corrected, and multiplied. When Europe later rediscovered ancient knowledge, much of it survived because Islamic scholars had written it down on paper, and paper did not stay in the libraries. It flooded into daily life. Baghdad's book markets stretched through covered arcades where a professional class of copyist booksellers, Dworikin, copied, sold, and recited books for a reading public centuries ahead of anywhere in Europe. Paper became the codex as we know it. Folded sheets sewn into bindings, the physical book that would rule for 1,000 years. Calligraphers elevated the page into art, reed pens gliding across surfaces burnished with agate stones until they gleamed. Paper even became money's messenger. Merchants trading across vast distances began trusting written checks and letters of credit, value traveling as ink instead of coin, along routes stretching from Spain to India. Astronomers filled paper with star tables. Physicians carried paper compendiums to bedsides. The Caliphate governed provinces months of travel apart through paper decrees, sealed in wax and carried by relay riders. An entire civilization learned to run on the page, and the technology kept marching west, mill by mill, Damascus, Cairo, across North Africa, and finally over the strait into Islamic Spain. In Cordoba, a visiting monk from northern Europe could stand frozen in a book market, clutching his single precious parchment volume, surrounded by stalls selling thousands of paper books, two of information worlds, staring at each other across a market lane. In the town of Zactiva, near Valencia, paper mills began working on European soil itself. In Toledo, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars sat at the same tables, translating the accumulated knowledge of the East into Latin, page by paper page, feeding the awakening that would soon transform Europe. The continent that had been last to receive paper was about to do something unexpected with it, attach it to a machine. Europe perceived paper-making late, and then did what medieval Europe did best. It added water power and muscle. The first European mills, in Spain and then Italy, kept the ancient heart of the craft, the vat, the screen, the practiced dip, but they mechanized the hardest labor. Instead of pounding fibers by hand, water-wheeled, driven camshafts lifted heavy wooden stamping hammers and dropped them into pulp troughs in thundering rhythm, day and night. One river could do the work of 100 arms, but Europe faced a raw material problem. No mulberry trees, no papyrus marshes. The solution was strange and brilliant old clothes. Europe made its paper from linen rags, the worn-out shirts and sheets of its own people. An entire hidden economy grew around it. Rag pickers, walking dawn streets with sacks over their shoulders, collectors trading bales, warehouse women's, sorting cloth by grade and color. When you wore out a shirt in medieval Europe, it did not disappear. It came back as a page. The Italian town of Fabriano turned the craft into an art of precision, and gave paper something entirely new, an invisible signature. By stitching a wire emblem onto the screen, papermakers left a faint translucent mark inside every sheet, visible only when held to the light. The watermark was born, brand identity, quality guarantee, an anti-fraud device, embedded in the paper itself. Fabriano's workshops also bathed their sheets in animal gelatin, hardening the surface so Europe's sharp quill pens would glide instead of tearing through. Then economics did the rest. Parchment was magnificent, but a single large book could consume the skins of an entire herd. Paper delivered a writing surface at a fraction of the price, and Europe's institutions noticed. Monastery scriptoria, after long deliberation between the abbot and the bursar, quietly switched their everyday copying to paper. Universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, filled with students scribbling notes on sheets they could actually afford. Stationers rented out unbound sections of textbooks so scholars could copy them. Piecemeal, medieval Europe, improvising, mass access to knowledge, before the machine existed to provide it. Commerce embraced paper hardest of all. Merchant houses stacked ledgers to the ceiling. Notaries drafted contracts at trade fairs. Banking houses folded bills of exchange, light paper slips, that moved fortunes across the continent, without moving a single coin chest. Royal chanceries, thickened with registers and petitions. Paper was quietly becoming the operating system of European civilization. By the mid-15th century, mills hammered along rivers from Spain to Germany, and paper was abundant, standardized, and cheap, which meant Europe now had a continent full of pages and a bottleneck. Every single one still had to be written by hand. In a workshop in Mainz, a goldsmith was about to fix that. In the 1450s, In the German city of Mainz, a metal worker named Johannes Gutenberg solved the last great bottleneck of the written word, and paper finally met its destiny. The problem was simple and brutal. A trained scribe, working by candlelight, could copy only a few pages a day. An entire Bible took years. Knowledge existed, paper existed, readers existed, but copying remained trapped at the speed of a single human hand. Gutenberg's answer was movable type. As a goldsmith, he understood metal, and his true masterpiece was almost invisible. A hand mold that could cast individual letters in. A lead alloy, each one identical in height to a fraction of a millimeter. Cast thousands of letters, arrange them into a page, and you have created something revolutionary, a text that can be printed, taken apart, and rearranged into any other text, forever. Around that small idea he built a system. An oil-based ink, sticky and dense, that clung to metal where water-based inks slid off. Leather ink balls to pound the color evenly across the type. Paper sheets dampened to exactly the right suppleness. And at the center, a heavy wooden screw press, borrowed from the world of wine and olives. Hold down with full-body effort to squeeze paper against inked metal with perfect, even pressure. Then the sheet peeled up, and there it was, a full page of crisp, uniform text, produced in seconds. Do it again, and the second copy matched the first exactly. Do it 300 times. You have printed in a week what a scriptorium produced in a lifetime. Gutenberg's workshop became the prototype of a new kind of place, part craft shop, part factory. Compositors clicked type into forms. Pressmen worked in rhythm. Freshly printed pages hung drying overhead like pale flags. His masterwork, a magnificent printed Bible, left visitors tracing the impossibly regular columns by candlelight, caught between wonder and disbelief. The inventor himself did not conquer the world. His financiers nearly did that to him, and lawsuits shadowed his greatest triumph. But the invention could not be contained. Journeymen trained in Mainz packed type cases onto wagons and carried the craft down winter roads to Venice, Paris, Nuremberg, and within a single generation, presses were hammering in hundreds of European cities, and every one of those presses was hungry. A scriptorium, zip paper, a printing press devoured it by the cartload, print and paper locked into a spiral that would define the modern world. Cheaper pages made more books possible, and more books demanded ever more paper. The scribe's age was ending. The age of mass information had begun, and no one, not kings, not popes, not Gutenberg himself, had any idea how far it would go, because once ideas learn to multiply faster than any authority can read them, the world does not stay the same for long. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's press, Europe printed more books than scribes had copied in the previous 1,000. And then paper stopped being merely useful. It became dangerous. Venice led the commercial revolution. Its printers pioneered small, affordable volumes, books that fit in a pocket, and traveled in a saddlebag, price for scholars, instead of princes. Suddenly a student could own his own copy of a classical text, instead of renting sections to copy by hand. University lecture halls, filled with rows of identical printed books, pages turning in loose synchrony. For the first time in history, an entire room of minds could literally be on the same page. Then, in 517, a German monk named Martin Luther put print's true power on display. His criticisms of church practice might once have circulated among a handful of theologians. Instead, printers seized them, and presses ran. Through the night, pamphlets, cheap, fast, and inflammatory, poured out by the hundreds of thousands and rode in saddlebags to every corner of the continent. Villagers who could not read gathered on church steps while a literate neighbor read the arguments aloud. Rival theologians fired back with counter-pamphlets, and Europe discovered something entirely new, a public argument conducted in print, at speed, before an audience of millions. The Reformation was many things, but as a media event, it ran on paper. Authority responded the only way it knew. Censors stamped approvals and confiscations. Banned books burned in town squares at dusk, pages curling into glowing fragments, while silent crowds watched. And it barely worked. Forbidden volumes simply passed hand to hand beneath tavern tables, wrapped in plain cloth, outrunning every decree. Print had made ideas physically impossible to recall. Meanwhile, quieter revolutions stacked up. Engraved plates put precise images, anatomy, machines, maps of newly reported coastlines, into mass circulation, and science acquired a shared visual language. Printed music spread compositions across borders. Playhouses rehearsed from printed scripts. Print shops became civic hubs handling playbills, proclamations, and prayer sheets. Private libraries, once royal privileges, became attainable middle-class dreams. And in cottage windows across the continent, ordinary people, including, increasingly, women and children, followed printed lines with a moving finger, sounding out a skill their grandparents never imagined possessing. Literacy fed printing, and printing fed literacy, and both devoured paper at a terrifying rate. Mills added vats and apprentices, and still fell behind. And the whole industry balanced on a supply chain of old shirts. Europe was reading faster than it was wearing out clothes. Something in the system had to break, and when it did, the answer would come from the forest. By the 18th century, Europe faced a crisis almost comic in its absurdity. Civilization was running out of rags. Mills stood half idle beside empty warehouses. Agents bid against each other at dockside auctions for bales of worn cloth. Some regions banned rag exports like strategic resources. The reading world's appetite had finally outgrown its own laundry. The way out had been buzzing overhead all along. Naturalists studying the paper wasp noticed that its gray papery nest was made of chewed wood. The insect had been manufacturing paper from trees for millions of years. The insight was electric. If a wasp could turn timber into paper, so could industry. It took decades of stubborn chemistry. Early wood pulp sheets were brittle and yellowed quickly. Inventors ground logs against wet spinning stones, tearing fibers free. Chemists cooked wood chips in iron digesters, dissolving away the glue that binds timber until nearly pure fiber remained, then bleached it toward clean white. Slowly, the forests surrendered, and paper's raw material became, for practical purposes, unlimited. Then came the second revolution, the machine that never stops. At the turn of the 19th century, a new invention, perfected in England and financed by the Fourdrinier brothers, whose name it still carries, reimagined paper-making itself. Instead of dipping one screen for one sheet, an endless wire mesh belt moved continuously under a flowing stream of pulp. Water drained through the vibrating mesh, fibers locked together, and a single unbroken ribbon of paper traveled onward, through press rolls and steam-heated drying cylinders, winding at the far end on massive reels. The ancient gesture, Cai Lun's dip, repeated one sheet at a time for 17 centuries, was compressed into one perpetual mechanical instant. Paper's unit of existence changed from the sheet to the ton. The scale that followed rearranged landscapes. Logging crews felled northern forests, and rivers ran white with log drives, daring men dancing across the moving timber with pike bowls. Mill towns grew. Around the machines, worker terraces, climbing valley sides toward the chimneys, whole communities living by the shift whistle. Railways ran spurs straight into mill yards, and paper broke free of its rivers, rolling out by the freight car, and the price collapsed. School children filled cheap exercise books without the old fear of waste. Postal halls flooded with letters as correspondence became an everyday habit rather than an occasion. Envelopes, ledgers, tickets, and forms poured off converting lines. The old vatmen watched from the gallery at the endless web outpaced every skill day, had spent lifetimes mastering. The human cost threaded quietly through the triumph. Paper was now cheap, white, and effectively infinite. All it needed was a voice loud enough to use it. That voice was about to start shouting every single morning. Every morning, for about a century and a half, humanity performed a ritual so ordinary no one thought to call it miraculous. Millions of strangers woke up and read the same words on the same cheap paper printed just hours before. The daily newspaper was the Internet before the Internet, and it ran entirely on the endless sheet. The machinery behind it was ferocious. Rotary presses replaced the flat press's careful squeeze, with spinning cylinders fed directly from massive newsprint reels, paper racing through the machines in a blur, printed on both sides, cut and folded at speeds Gutenberg could not have dreamed. Later, linotype machines mechanized typesetting itself, operators at clattering keyboards, casting whole lines of type from molten metal. A single night shift could manufacture hundreds of thousands of copies, and the content arrived at lightning speed too. Telegraph wires pour the world's events directly into newsrooms. A battle, a shipwreck, a market crash on another continent could land on breakfast tables within a day. War correspondents scribbled dispatches by candlelight in field tents. Editors slashed and rearranged copy against merciless deadlines. The modern rhythm of news, the scoop, the edition, the headline, was invented in these gaslit rooms. Then, before dawn, the logistics sprint, bundles sliding down chutes into loading bays, wagons clattering into dark streets, children folding papers on tenement stoops before school, newsboys fanning out across waking squares. At my morning rush, tram carriages became walls of raised broadsheets, strangers sitting shoulder to shoulder, privately synchronized by the same front page. The effects ran deep. Politics became a daily public conversation. During breaking news, crowds pressed against newspaper office windows where fresh bulletins were pasted up. The paper age's version of the live feed. Markets breathed through morning listings marked in pencil at coffeehouse counters. Campaigners for every cause, from labor rights to women's suffrage, pressed printed broadsides into the hands of factory crowds. Even the smallest towns had their weekly, the editor-printer's shopfront doubling as a community's nervous system. Behind it all, the paper industry swelled to match. Newsprint demand reshaped entire regional economies. Mills multiplied down northern river valleys, each complex, larger than the last. Reels taller than the men handling them rolled from rail cars to metropolitan press-room basements, the nightly tonnage beneath every morning edition. And the age even learned to recirculate its own flood. Yesterday's news baled and pulped into tomorrow's. For the first time in history, an ordinary person's day was bracketed by print. News at breakfast, tickets and forms at work, a novel by lamplight. And paper was still just getting started, because the 20th century was about to ask paper to do everything else. Here is a strange truth about the 20th century. We remember it as the age of electricity, automobiles, and flight. But day to day, hour to hour, it was the age of paper. Paper did not just record the century. Paper packaged it, paid for it, organized it, and carried its love letters. Start with packaging. Tough brown craft paper became the skin of commerce, the grocer's swift wrap and tie, the parcel in the post. Then came a quiet piece of engineering genius, corrugated cardboard, a fluted paper wave glued between flat liners, light as paper but rigid as board, the humble cardboard. Boss became the basic building block of global trade. Everything you have ever owned probably traveled in one. Wax paperboard cartons lightened the milk run. Paper bags, cups, tickets, and wrappers threaded through every ordinary day. Paper also became value itself. Banknotes, engraved on tough cotton fiber paper laced with hidden threads and translucent watermarks, descended straight from Fabriano's medieval trick, put centuries of paper-making secrecy into every pocket. Checks moved fortunes. Stamps, bonds, and contracts made paper the physical body of trust, and democracy placed its most sacred act on it, the folded ballot, dropped into a sealed box under watchful eyes. The office, meanwhile, became a paper machine. Ranks of typewriters clattered across mid-century floors. Carbon paper multiplied, every document in triplicate. Filing cabinets rose into canyon walls of records. Archivists, rolling ladders along kilometer shelves of institutional memory. White-collar civilization ran on forms, memos, and files, and built towers to hold the people who processed them. And through the century's darkest hours, paper carried its most human cargo. Soldiers at muddy fronts read creased letters from home, rain dripping from helmet rims onto handwriting they knew by heart. Mothers wrote at kitchen tables to sons oceans away. Wartime paper drives sent children hauling wagons of salvaged newsprint, paper deemed strategic enough to fight over. And when peace came, it fell from office windows as ticker tape whole canyons snowing shredded paper onto parades. The gentler moments belonged to paper too, bright wrapping torn from birthday gifts, snapshots slipped into family albums, cheap paperbacks spinning on drugstore racks, putting literature in every pocket, prescriptions and report cards and boarding passes. The small, trusted slips a life accumulates, feeding all of it. Mill complexes grew to colossal scale. Kilometer-long machines supervised from control rooms, container ships hauling reels across oceans. Paper had become a planetary metabolism, and then, in the century's final decades, office workers looked up from their in trays at a strange new arrival, a humming terminal with a green glowing screen. Paper's first true rival in 2,000 years had just been plugged in. In the 1970s, experts began predicting the paperless office. Computers would handle everything. Paper would fade like the telegraph. It became one of the most famously wrong predictions of the modern age, because for decades, computers actually made us print more. Every screen seemed to end at a printer. Every office proclaimed itself paperless, while fresh stacks landed in the trays. But paper's survival runs deeper than habit. It survived by transforming. The digital economy itself arrives wrapped in paper. Every online order lands on a doorstep in a cardboard box. Delivery depots at peak season run rivers of parcels. E-commerce quietly made corrugated paper more essential than ever. Paper became the champion of the anti-plastic future too, with engineers testing molded fiber packaging in materials labs, pushing the world's oldest manufactured material toward its newest job. It also became circular. Today's paper industry is one of the most recycled on Earth. Mountains of used cardboard and newsprint ride conveyors back into pulpers, printed fragments dissolving. As clean fiber blooms through the water, yesterday's pages becoming tomorrow's blank sheet. Managed forests roll toward horizons in waves of harvest and regrowth, an uneasy but real pact between industry and its living source. And where trust matters most, paper never left. Voters still mark paper ballots. Archives still trust acid-free paper over any format that needs electricity to be read, because a page, unlike a file, cannot become unreadable when its software dies. Conservators in climate-controlled rooms mend centuries-old documents with tissue and paste, while technicians scan them page by page. The paper original and its digital ghost, sharing the same frame, strangest of all, paper became sanctuary. In a world of endless notifications, people rediscovered the page as the one place that never interrupts. Journals, letters, sketchbooks, a calligrapher's brush moving while the phone buzzes ignored. Readers choosing the physical book by the rain-streaked window for the texture, the scent, the quiet. Children at workshop tables still lift dripping screens from tubs of pulp, wonder breaking across their faces at the forming sheet. Cai Lun's exact gesture, alive in new small hands after 2,000 years. So look again at that piece of paper near you. It carries the cave walls, handprint, the scribe's clay, the Nile's reeds, a Chinese courtyard's genius, Samarkand's mills, Gutenberg's press, and the endless machine, the entire relay race of human memory, folded into something you were about to throw away. Every revolution promised to replace it. Every revolution ended up written on it, and somewhere on your desk, a blank page is still waiting. Same quiet invitation it has offered 4,000 years for whatever humanity decides to write next.